Have you ever been in a room full of people, holding a completely normal conversation, smiling at the right moments, saying all the expected things, and still felt strangely disconnected? Not lonely in the obvious sense, not excluded, not rejected, just quietly separate, as if everyone else is participating in the same invisible rhythm, and somehow you're hearing a slightly different version of the music. If you've experienced that, your first instinct may have been to explain it in familiar ways. Maybe you assumed you were becoming antisocial. Maybe you told yourself you simply dislike small talk. Maybe you wondered if you had become emotionally distant, difficult, or somehow harder to connect with than other people. But what if none of those explanations are entirely accurate? What if the issue is not that you dislike people, not that you believe you are better than them, and not that something in your social wiring is broken, but that your mind processes reality differently? Psychology has long suggested that intelligence is not merely about knowledge, memory, or academic performance. In many cases, it's about how the brain organizes information, detects patterns, tolerates ambiguity, and interprets social environments. And sometimes, that difference creates experiences that are difficult to explain. Because here's the strange paradox. Some of the sharpest minds are not the loudest in the room. They are often quieter, more internally occupied, more likely to question themselves rather than confidently assert opinions. They may become mentally exhausted in environments that others find energizing. They may struggle with conversations that feel repetitive or emotionally flat, not because they lack empathy, but because their minds naturally search for depth, complexity, and meaning. This is where many common assumptions begin to fail. Society tends to imagine intelligence in a very visible way. Fast talkers, charismatic debaters, effortless confidence. The kind of person who always seems to have an immediate answer. But real cognitive complexity often looks much quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like emotional overwhelm. And sometimes it looks like someone who feels profoundly misunderstood, even while appearing completely functional on the outside. In this video, we're going to explore 7 hidden psychological patterns often found in highly intelligent minds. Not stereotypes, not flattering myths, but deeper cognitive and emotional mechanisms that may explain why certain people experience the world so differently. And by the final pattern, you may begin to understand why some of the most intelligent people often feel like the loneliest. The first pattern is something people often misunderstand almost immediately. From the outside, it looks simple. Someone pauses too long before answering a question. They replay a conversation hours after it ended. They hesitate over decisions that seem minor to everyone else. They ask follow-up questions nobody else thought to ask. And eventually someone says the familiar phrase, "You think too much." But psychology suggests something more nuanced may be happening. For some highly intelligent individuals, the issue is not ordinary overthinking in the emotional sense. It is a form of heightened metacognition, the mind's ability to observe, evaluate, and continuously monitor its own thinking process. In simple terms, they are not just having thoughts. They are thinking about their thoughts while having them, and then evaluating whether those thoughts are accurate, and then considering what they may have missed. This creates a very different internal experience. While many people primarily respond to the event directly in front of them, a more cognitively complex mind often does something else entirely. It begins simulating. A simple interaction does not remain a simple interaction. It branches. If someone sends a short message, the brain may begin mapping multiple interpretations. Were they busy, upset, distracted, pulling away emotionally? If a decision needs to be made, the mind may instantly generate consequence trees. If I choose this, what happens next? And after that? What does that affect? How will other people respond? What emotional outcome does this create? What unseen variable am I ignoring? This process is closely associated with the prefrontal cortex, the region involved in planning, executive control, anticipation, and complex reasoning. In highly analytical individuals, this system can become unusually active, creating what feels like a constant predictive simulation loop. The brain is not simply observing the present. It is rehearsing possible futures. One way to think about it is this. Most people use a flashlight. They look at what is directly in front of them. But some minds operate more like a war room simulation map. Possible routes, hidden risks, secondary consequences, human reactions, contingencies, all running quietly in the background. And because this process is invisible, others often mistake it for anxiety, indecision, or emotional complication. Sometimes, to be fair, it can become those things. but often it begins as cognitive pattern processing, not dysfunction. The paradox is that this ability can be incredibly useful. It allows for foresight, strategic thinking, pattern recognition, better judgment in uncertain environments. But it also creates a quieter burden. Because when your mind is constantly scanning for what might happen next, genuine mental rest becomes difficult. Even peaceful moments can feel mentally occupied. Even ordinary conversations can become layered with analysis. And this is where the deeper paradox begins. Because this constant awareness comes with a cost. The second pattern is often mistaken for something deeply personal. From the outside, it can look like arrogance. Someone stays quiet during casual conversation. They seem uninterested when the discussion circles around predictable topics. They offer short responses to messages that others might happily continue for hours. And the interpretation comes quickly. Snobbish, awkward, too serious. But what if the real explanation has less to do with personality and more to do with cognitive appetite? Psychologists sometimes describe a trait called need for cognition, the tendency to enjoy deep thinking, conceptual exploration, and mentally demanding reflection. Some people feel energized by complexity, not because they are trying to impress anyone, not because they believe ordinary conversation is beneath them, but because their minds naturally seek stimulation through ideas, patterns, abstraction, novel perspectives, questions that do not have immediate answers. For these individuals, conversation is not simply social exchange, it is also cognitive engagement. And when that engagement is missing, something subtle happens. The interaction begins to feel mentally flat. Think about the kinds of exchanges that fill much of modern social life: small observations about the weather, repeated office conversations about deadlines, meetings, or weekend plans, text messages that never move beyond surface updates, polite but predictable exchanges that follow familiar scripts. None of these things are inherently meaningless. In fact, for many people, they create comfort, routine, and connection. But for a mind that craves conceptual stimulation, these interactions can feel strangely undernourishing, almost like trying to satisfy intellectual hunger with something that was never meant to nourish it. Like feeding a race engine with candle wax. The engine still runs, technically, but not in the way it was built to. This is why some highly intelligent individuals may appear emotionally distant in ordinary conversation, when internally, something much simpler is happening. Their attention is drifting, not because they do not care about people, but because the interaction is not giving the brain enough complexity to remain fully engaged. This can create an uncomfortable social paradox. The very people who deeply long for meaningful connection may struggle with the forms of communication most people use to create it, because connection often begins with simplicity, but their minds are searching for depth. And over time, this mismatch becomes painful, not dramatic, not obvious, just quietly persistent. They may begin to wonder why social interaction feels effortful when others seem to move through it naturally. Why conversations leave them tired rather than energized. Why being surrounded by people does not always create a feeling of closeness. And eventually, some begin withdrawing, not out of superiority, but out of exhaustion. Because when the mind constantly longs for richer engagement, ordinary connection can start to feel emotionally unreachable. And this is where something deeper begins to emerge. This is where loneliness begins. The third pattern is more difficult to explain, because from the outside it often looks invisible. Nothing dramatic happens, no obvious conflict, no direct words are spoken. And yet, somehow, they already sense that something has changed, a slight shift in someone's expression. A pause that lasted half a second longer than usual. A voice that sounds almost identical to before, except for something faintly altered in tone. A tension in the room no one else seems to acknowledge. And when they mention it, they are often told they are imagining things. You're reading too much into it. You're being too sensitive. But psychology suggests there may be something more happening beneath the surface. Some highly intelligent individuals develop unusually strong pattern recognition, combined with heightened emotional sensitivity. This creates a mind that is not only processing information quickly, but constantly comparing subtle social signals against previous experiences. Psychologists sometimes refer to one aspect of this as thin slicing, the brain's ability to make rapid judgments based on very small fragments of information. A facial expression, a shift in posture, a moment of hesitation, a change in speech rhythm. These fragments may seem insignificant in isolation, but to a brain skilled in social cognition, they become meaningful patterns. And when emotional sensitivity overlaps with this ability, the experience becomes even more intense. because it is not simply noticing signals, it is feeling them. Someone else's discomfort may not register as neutral data. It may land as emotional information inside the nervous system. This is why some people seem to know something is wrong before anyone says a word. Not because they are psychic, not because they are overreacting, but because their brain is constantly gathering subtle cues and constructing emotional meaning from them. And in some environments, this ability can be incredibly useful. It helps detect dishonesty, unspoken tension, hidden conflict, emotional inconsistency. A powerful radar is useful until it never turns off, because what begins as awareness can slowly become overload. Too much incoming information, too many emotional signals, too many details the brain refuses to filter out. And eventually, ordinary social environments stop feeling ordinary. A crowded room becomes exhausting. Emotionally charged conversations linger for hours. Someone else's mood quietly enters your system and stays there. So pause here for a moment. If you've spent much of your life feeling too sensitive, too emotionally aware, too affected by subtle things other people seem to ignore, this may not be weakness, it may not be fragility, it may not even be emotional overreaction in the way you were taught to believe. It may be how your nervous system adapted, because some minds are built or shaped to notice more. And while that can create remarkable insight, it can also create a kind of invisible fatigue that few people fully understand, which leads to another paradox. The more clearly you perceive complexity in the world around you, the harder it can become to feel certain about yourself. The fourth pattern may be one of the most misunderstood paradoxes of intelligence. We often assume confidence is a sign of competence, that people who speak quickly, answer immediately, and express certainty must understand more, and people who hesitate, who qualify their statements, who say, "I'm not completely sure," but they are often perceived as less knowledgeable. But psychology has repeatedly pointed toward a more complicated reality. There is a well-known phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect, often simplified to mean that people with lower competence tend to overestimate their abilities, while those with greater competence are more likely to recognize complexity and uncertainty. In other words, less information can create certainty. More information often creates ambiguity awareness, because knowledge changes the way the mind sees reality. When understanding is shallow, problems appear clean and manageable. The edges look clear, the answers feel obvious. But as understanding deepens, something unexpected happens. The structure becomes more complicated, exceptions emerge, variables multiply, hidden assumptions become visible, and certainty becomes harder to maintain. This is sometimes connected to something philosophers and psychologists describe as epistemic humility, the awareness of the limits of one's own knowledge. Not insecurity, not weakness, but intellectual honesty, a recognition that reality is often far more layered than it first appears. This creates a very specific inner experience for highly intelligent individuals. They may question their own conclusions repeatedly, reread messages before sending them, mentally rehearse what they plan to say, then edit it internally several times before speaking. Not because they have nothing meaningful to contribute, but because they can already see possible flaws in their own reasoning, possible counter-arguments, alternative interpretations, unseen variables. This is where imposter syndrome often begins to quietly take root. Not necessarily because someone lacks competence, but because the more they understand, the harder it becomes to feel absolute confidence in what they know. The smarter the map gets, the more blank territory it reveals. And that realization can be psychologically exhausting, especially in environments that reward speed over reflection, certainty over nuance, confidence over accuracy. Because while others may speak with effortless conviction, the highly analytical mind is often still running internal verification checks. Is this accurate? Am I missing context? Could there be another explanation? What if I'm wrong? Over time, this can create chronic self-checking, not just in intellectual spaces, but in relationships, work decisions, and ordinary conversations. A hesitation that others may misread as insecurity, when in reality, it may be the burden of seeing complexity more clearly. The paradox, of course, is that this hesitation can sometimes make genuinely capable people appear less certain than those who understand far less. And yet, this same self-questioning often protects them from simplistic thinking. Still, there is another side to this pattern, because when the mind becomes deeply aware of complexity, it does not just question knowledge. Sometimes, it begins craving something else entirely. The fifth pattern often looks like inconsistency. From the outside, it can be confusing. Someone becomes intensely fascinated by a subject, diving into it with remarkable focus. They read obsessively, learn quickly, master concepts that would take others much longer to understand. And then, just as suddenly, they seem to lose interest. A new subject appears, a different idea takes over. Another project begins. To others, this can look like lack of discipline, restlessness, even wasted potential. Why can't they just stick with one thing? But psychology offers a different interpretation. Part of this pattern may be linked to the brain's reward prediction system, particularly the role dopamine plays in motivation and learning. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, but its role is more subtle than that. It is deeply involved in anticipation, novelty detection, and the prediction of reward. In practical terms, the brain becomes highly engaged not simply when something is enjoyable, but when something feels mentally stimulating, uncertain, or newly solvable. This matters because some highly intelligent minds process novelty differently. Simple, repetitive tasks may offer very little reward stimulation, not because the person is lazy, not because they lack responsibility, but because once the pattern is understood, the brain no longer experiences meaningful engagement. The challenge disappears, and with it the reward signal begins to fade. Novel problems, on the other hand, create activation, uncertainty, discovery, cognitive tension, a puzzle that has not yet been solved. This is why some individuals move rapidly between interests, not because they are incapable of commitment, but because mastery changes the emotional chemistry of the experience. Once something becomes predictable, the mind may quietly disengage. This can create a recognizable life pattern, jumping between passions, abandoning skills they have already become highly competent in, feeling intellectually bored in environments others find stable or satisfying, even developing career paths that appear fragmented or unstable from the outside. And over time, this can create shame, especially in cultures that celebrate consistency as the highest form of maturity. But not all inconsistency is dysfunction. Sometimes it is cognitive novelty seeking, a mind that is less motivated by repetition and more motivated by exploration, a nervous system that responds more strongly to complexity than familiarity. Of course, this pattern has its costs. Projects left unfinished, potential left partially realized, a lingering sense of never fully arriving anywhere. But it also explains something important: why some people are not searching for comfort. They are searching for intellectual aliveness, for the feeling of encountering something they do not yet understand. And perhaps that longing says less about instability than we assume. Still, even this does not explain the quietest pattern of all, because sometimes the issue is not what highly intelligent people seek. Sometimes it is what they need to recover from. But even this isn't the deepest layer. The sixth pattern is one that is often judged unfairly. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal. Someone leaves social gatherings early. They decline invitations they would have accepted before. They spend long stretches alone, not out of visible sadness but by choice. And because human behavior is so often interpreted through social norms, the labels arrive quickly. Loner, detached, antisocial, maybe even emotionally unavailable. But what if solitude is not rejection? What if psychologically it is recovery? One of the quieter realities of high cognitive sensitivity is that social interaction is not simply emotional exchange. It is information processing. Every conversation requires attention. Facial expressions must be interpreted. Tone must be tracked. Responses must be formulated. Social context must be monitored. Subtle emotional shifts must be registered, often unconsciously. For some individuals, this process happens with unusual intensity, which means even pleasant interaction can create substantial cognitive load. This is where the misunderstanding begins, because exhaustion does not always mean dislike. Sometimes it simply means the system has reached capacity. Psychologically, this can be understood through cognitive load regulation. The brain has finite attentional resources, and when too much information accumulates, social, emotional, sensory, conversational, the nervous system begins seeking relief, not dramatically, quietly. A desire to step away, to reduce input, to become still. There is also another layer. Some researchers point toward the role of the default mode network, a brain system associated with internal reflection, autobiographical thinking, meaning-making, and mental integration. For deeply reflective individuals, periods of solitude may allow this system to reset and reorganize, not because they are escaping life, but because their mind needs uninterrupted space to process it. Sensory reset matters too. Crowded spaces, background conversations, unexpected interruptions, social unpredictability. For some nervous systems, these experiences are not mildly tiring. They are cognitively expensive, which makes solitude less of a preference and more of a restoration mechanism. Solitude is system maintenance, and that distinction matters, because many highly intelligent or highly sensitive individuals do not avoid people because they hate connection. In fact, some crave meaningful connection very deeply. What they avoid is overload, the emotional saturation that comes when too much enters the system without enough time to recover. This creates another painful paradox. The same person who longs for closeness may also need distance to remain emotionally regulated. The same person who values intimacy may become exhausted by prolonged interaction. And because others often interpret withdrawal personally, this pattern can create guilt, misunderstanding, relationship strain, a quiet fear of being perceived as cold. But sometimes stepping away is not emotional absence, it is nervous system preservation. And still, even after understanding all of this, some people continue to feel something harder to explain, not just tired, not just overstimulated, but fundamentally out of sync with the world around them. The seventh pattern is the quietest one, and perhaps the hardest to explain, because it does not always look like a behavioral habit. Sometimes it feels more like a persistent emotional atmosphere, a subtle sense of distance that follows you even in moments that should feel fulfilling. You achieve something important, and the satisfaction fades faster than expected. You sit in a room full of people who genuinely like you and still feel strangely separate. A conversation is flowing normally, yet part of you watches it from a distance, wondering why it feels so scripted, why everyone seems to know how to move through ordinary life so naturally, why certain questions keep returning, even when life appears objectively stable. Why am I here? What is all of this actually for? Why do I feel disconnected even when nothing is obviously wrong? This is where the conversation moves beyond personality, beyond social habits, beyond communication style. Because one of the hidden truths about highly intelligent minds is that increased cognitive complexity can sometimes create existential alienation. Not depression, necessarily, not dysfunction, but a deeper form of psychological distance created by heightened awareness. Part of this begins with abstract self-awareness, the ability to think not only about events, but about yourself as the observer inside those events, to examine your own motives, question your reactions, analyze your place in larger systems. Notice the stories people tell themselves, and the stories you tell yourself too. Then there is meaning sensitivity. Some people can comfortably accept routines, roles, and expectations without needing them to feel deeply coherent. Others struggle with that, not because they are rebellious, but because their minds keep searching for deeper significance. If something feels empty, artificial, or disconnected from meaning, the discomfort can become difficult to ignore. Mortality cognition adds another layer. An awareness not always conscious, but present. That time is limited. That choices matter. That life is finite. That many of the systems people organize themselves around may be temporary constructions. And then there is pattern consciousness, the tendency to notice recurring structures everywhere. In relationships, institutions, conversational roles, human behavior itself, this creates an unusual burden. Because once you begin seeing patterns beneath the surface, it becomes harder to participate in things without also noticing their mechanics. Some minds don't just think faster, they think deeper into places most people avoid. And that depth can be profoundly isolating. Because not everyone wants to sit with existential uncertainty. Not everyone wants to question the assumptions beneath ordinary life. Not everyone feels compelled to search for meaning inside everything. But for some minds, that search never fully stops. Which means the loneliness they feel is not always social. Sometimes it is philosophical. A feeling of standing slightly outside the shared emotional reality others seem to inhabit so effortlessly. And yet, understanding this changes something important. Because what feels like disconnection may not be emptiness. It may be the emotional cost of seeing life through a wider lens. If you recognized yourself in some of these patterns, it may be tempting to arrive at a harsh conclusion, that something about you is fundamentally off, that you are too complicated for ordinary connection, too sensitive for the environments you move through, too mentally restless to ever feel at peace, too different to be fully understood. But perhaps the more accurate question is this: what if you have been interpreting adaptation as dysfunction? Because many of the patterns we explored today can look uncomfortable from the outside. Overthinking can resemble anxiety, sensitivity can resemble fragility, solitude can resemble avoidance. Self-doubt can resemble insecurity, and existential questioning can resemble dissatisfaction. But psychological reality is often more nuanced than appearances suggest. A mind that constantly simulates possibilities may not be broken, it may be highly predictive. A nervous system that absorbs emotional nuance may not be weak. It may simply process more information than average. A person who needs space after social interaction may not be disconnected. They may be regulating cognitive overload. And someone who struggles with shallow certainty may not lack confidence. They may simply understand how complex reality actually is. This does not mean every difficult experience should be romanticized. Intelligence does not protect anyone from anxiety, burnout, loneliness, or emotional pain. Greater awareness can create its own burdens, sometimes very heavy ones. But understanding the mechanism behind an experience changes the emotional meaning of that experience. Because confusion often creates shame, and shame tends to grow wherever understanding is absent. So if you've spent years believing your loneliness means failure, that your sensitivity means emotional weakness, that your overthinking means something is wrong with your mind, it may be worth considering a gentler interpretation. Perhaps you are not failing at being human. Perhaps you are navigating life with a different cognitive operating system, one that notices more, processes more, questions more, feels more, and yes, sometimes becomes exhausted because of it. But difference is not the same thing as damage. Maybe intelligence is not about having more answers. Maybe it is about being unable to stop asking better questions. Questions about people, about meaning, about truth, about yourself. And perhaps that relentless questioning is not a flaw to eliminate, but a part of how your mind makes sense of the world. So before we end, I'd like you to reflect on something. Of everything we explored today, what has felt hardest for you? The overthinking, the loneliness, the emotional overload, or the feeling of being misunderstood, even when you struggle to explain yourself? If any part of this resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Because sometimes the most healing realization is discovering that the patterns you thought isolated you are quietly understood by more people than you imagined. Deep Ravine's lab protocol. Characters and stories are AI generated for motivational insights. 2. Content is curated for entertainment and exploring the messiness of human psyche. 3. No proselytizing or harmful content.